Okay, I'm going to entitle the first session tonight a critique of biological evolution. Now, let me just, again, just like yesterday, there's going to be some overlap, and I really didn't know everything Skip was going to say in his sessions, nor did he and I, but there's going to be some overlap again with what he talked about yesterday of necessity. But again, I'll be going a different direction with it than he did. For those of you that were here last night, Skip talked a lot about biology and used that to conclude that there is really no reason biblically for any such thing as races. There's only one race, the human race. And that's a strong argument against racism. We're all the same color. It's melanin. It's just a matter of how much of it we have, right, based on genetics. And so that was an excellent presentation yesterday. But I'm going to look at some of the same material, but the only question I'm going to try to answer is, what is the best explanation for the origin of life? Is it evolution or is it creation? And we're going to basically critique biological evolution. And I mentioned in my session yesterday that you cannot prove either creation or evolution with the scientific method. It cannot be done. But what you can do is look at the two different models and look at the evidence that we have in the present and see which model best explains the evidence, which is more plausible in light of the evidence that we see. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the claims of the Bible and the claims of evolution, look at some evidence, and we'll have to determine what is the best explanation for the evidence. So a lot of this material, I'll give credit to Mike Riddle. A lot of it I got originally from a presentation by him. Mike has worked for ICR. Mike has worked for Answers in Genesis. You probably know Mike.
Very well.
So he's worked for different organizations, but I've modified what he originally put together, but I'll give credit to him. But let me start, when we talk about the evolutionary tree of life, let's start right down here at the bottom. If we go from let's say to microbiologist, and we go up this evolutionary tree, we've got to start somewhere. Somewhere down at the bottom, there's got to be the first life form before biological evolution can even kick into place. Because you have to have an organism capable of reproduction before you can even talk about evolution. So we really have to start here and ask the question, where did life originate from? How did it start? And really, there's only two possible explanations. The possibilities are life evolved by natural processes or life was created. And with those two, you really exhaust the possibilities. I realize there's variations of those, but in essence, those are the only two possibilities for the origin of life. Let's look at the model of evolution and see what that says. The current model says that about 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth was formed. Chemicals formed in the primordial soup that was on the early Earth. You've probably seen illustrations of that. Chemicals bonded together to form molecules. Some of these molecules then came together to make proteins, and eventually they came together to form a simple life form. And yet the formula you could use then was time plus chance eventually equals life. And that's the evolutionary model. In contrast, the Bible is very clear. Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him were all things created." Contrast is talking about the Lord Jesus Christ, that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether there be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. So we have two very different explanations for the origin of life. The late British scientist Sir Fred Hoyle once made this statement. He said the chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way. In this way, he's talking about the spontaneous generation of life from non-life, so-called chemical evolution. All right, he said the chance of this happening is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Now, why would he make a statement like that? Well, when you think about a Boeing 747, it has about 4.5 million individual parts. And none of those parts fly by themselves. But they can be put together in such a way as designed by a human engineer that they can fly. A cell, in contrast, has not millions, but literally billions of non-living parts, none of them in and of themselves alive, but they can come together in such a way that you have life. And of course, all of us know you can have all of the parts, this is just intuitive, you can have all the parts necessary to build that Boeing 747, and maybe they're out in a field somewhere, and every single part that you need is already there. You can run a tornado through that 100 million times, you're never going to assemble a Boeing 747 from that tornado, and we all know that. It's very obvious. For life to form, amino acids must be arranged in exact sequences, just like letters in a sentence, to form protein molecules. And you all know how that works. You can use an example of something like the game Scrabble. We've probably all played that, and you know how that works. You can arrange individual letters in such a way that they actually communicate a message. You can form words from the individual letters that communicate something. I'm going to talk a little bit about probability, all right, and use flipping a coin as an illustration of probability, just to give us a picture of how this works. I think we all know that if someone has a coin, be it a penny, like in that picture, a quarter or whatever, what are the odds of getting a heads when I flip it one time? 50%. Everybody knows that. That's 1 in 2. The odds of getting 2 heads in a row are 1 in 4. The odds of getting 3 in a row are 1 in 8. 8 in a row are 1 in 256. The odds of getting 100 in a row are 2 to the 100th power, or 10 to the 30th power, and 1 with 30 zeros after. Now let me ask a question. If some guy came in here with a quarter, and he flipped it 100 times, and all 100 times it landed on heads, how many of you believe that that is a real quarter? Does anybody believe that? All right, it is obvious that that quarter is a 2-headed coin if he flips it 100 times, and every single time it lands heads. Welcome, come on in. And I think that's obvious to all of us. Now let's talk about probability when it comes to amino acids being arranged in such a way that you can form a simple life form. There's 20 different amino acids that make up the proteins of life. Let's assume that we're only going to form a small protein of 100 amino acids. That's far less than what you need for life. But let's say we're going to form a protein of 100 amino acids. What are the odds of forming that the right way? Well, the odds would be 1 in 20 to the 100th power, or 10 to the 130th power. Again, a 1 with 130 zeros after it. It's a huge number. Now, some evolutionists will counter that argument I just made and say, well, sometimes you can substitute one amino acid for another and still get the same basic function of that resulting protein. All right, and even accounting for that, however, that is true, but even accounting for that, information scientist Hubert Yockey has calculated, and MIT biologist Robert Sauer has confirmed by experimentation, that this would only increase the probability to 1 in 10 to the 65th power. So now we have a 1 with 65 zeros after, and that's a number none of us can fathom. It is so huge. And I want to highlight for a second, I got these statistics from a book called The Pandas and People, co-authored by this man here. I want to highlight him. His name is Dean Kenyon. Dean Kenyon was once the leading expert in the world on this subject of biochemical evolution, life from non-life, spontaneous generation. He wrote a book called Biochemical Predestination, and that was the standard textbook on this subject. Do you realize that Dean Kenyon now rejects all of that? He's actually a part of the intelligent design movement, and now believes there's overwhelming evidence that life has to come from an intelligent source, and he's rejected that entirely, even though he was once one of the world's leading experts on that subject. But moving on, let's compare that number. Since that's the number, how can we visualize a number like that? Compare that number. If the universe were 30 billion years old, and that's actually even older than they say it is today, but even then it would only be 10 to the 18th seconds in the theoretical history of the universe. And keep in mind, 10 to the 19th is 10 times more than 10 to the 18th, and 10 to the 20th is 10 times more than 10 to the 19th, and we're talking 10 to the 65th. That's an incredible number. So there's not enough time to even attempt to assemble all the possible combinations. Even if you could assemble a new protein 1 a second with all these amino acids, you don't even have a fraction of the time in the history of the universe. And microbiologists estimate that the simplest life form, absolute simplest, would be at least 400 amino acids. Let me give you something else to think about. Sir Fred Hoyle, the late British scientist, and Chandra Wickramasinghe actually at one point used computers to calculate the odds for the formation of the 2,000 or so enzymes needed to give rise to an amoeba, a simple one-cell organism. And they came up with this number, 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. was the odds of that happening by chance? And let me give you a quote from them. They said the likelihood of the spontaneous formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 knots after it. It's big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other, and if the beginnings of life were not random, they must have been the product of purposeful intelligence. So what you end up here is a couple of what you might call reluctant creationists. Now, they were never creationists like I am, but nonetheless, they looked at the statistics and they have concluded there is no way that that happened by chance. Matter of fact, the statistics like that have caused a lot of evolutionists in recent years to actually begin to postulate a theory called panspermia, the idea that life actually came from outer space, and it was seeded here on planet Earth. And let me give you a quote here. It says, about a decade ago, Orville and Crick, Francis Orville and Leslie Crick, managed to provoke the public and their colleagues by speculating that the seeds of life were sent to the Earth in a spaceship by intelligent beings living on another planet. Orville says the proposal, which is known as direct panspermia, was, quote, sort of a joke. Now let me ask you a question for a second. If life came from outer space, does that really solve the problem? It kicks the can down the road. It just moves the problem back. Because my question is, are the odds any better in space? How are the odds any better in space? Because life still had to start somewhere, right? So all they've done is kick it back. And they're grasping at straws trying to find anything that would be against the idea of a creator or a God. So now I'm proposing it came from space, possibly. And it's absolutely unbelievable that they are. Now, everything I've said so far, a lot of evolutionists would counter that and say, okay, that's all maybe well and true, but if you have enough time, anything can happen. Well, I have two questions. Is that a valid statement, and is that about a scientific statement? I would like to argue definitively it is neither. All right, let's review here for a second. Probability of a single protein of only 100 amino acids forming by chance is 1 to the 10 to the 130th power. A single cell, that simple amoeba forming by chance would be 1 to 10 to the 40,000th power. 30 billion years of time in the universe would equal only 10 to the 18 seconds. So therefore we conclude this, with this quote here, the likelihood of life having occurred through a chemical accident is for all intents and purposes 0. And the thing is, even the secular scientists, when they're honest, they know this. Let me illustrate this. Several years ago, I had the privilege of going to the Smithsonian Institute, and I visited the Museum of Natural History there. And I wish I had taken a picture of a particular display that was there. I did not, and I went back years later and I couldn't find it anymore because I was going to take a picture. The picture wasn't there. But I was in a section of the museum where they were talking about this subject, the spontaneous generation of life, and they had a little animation playing there that showed you exactly how they thought it was on the early Earth, and this primeval soup, and these chemicals coming together, and this little life form forming, and all this animation showing you that. But there was a sign there that said this, and this is the gist of it. I don't remember the exact wording. But we now know that all of life came from one source because of the incredible improbability of it happening twice. Now, I don't claim to be as smart as the scientists at the Smithsonian Institution, but here's my question. If it couldn't happen a second time, how did it happen the first time? You know what the answer is? Because we're here. And we've already ruled out the possibility of a designer. You remember, if you were here yesterday, we talked about that. They've ruled that out from the start. All right, their presupposition is there can be no designer. So they know it happened once because we're here, because life is here. But they look at the probability and say it didn't happen twice. It's too improbable for it to happen twice. So even they know that when they're honest. Another problem they had, there was a famous experiment several years ago, perhaps you've heard of it, by a man named Stanley Miller. He was trying to reproduce what he thought the conditions were in the early Earth, and he actually had the various elements there, ran a spark through it, and he came up mainly with tar and some stuff that wouldn't be helpful in any way, shape, or form, but he did get a few amino acids, and everyone held that almost like he produced life in a test tube. But the problem was the amino acids that he got from that were both left and right-handed. The amino acids occur in both forms in nature. But the problem is, in life, they're 100% left-handed. So if you add even one right-handed amino acid into that mix, it destroys the whole thing. So how on earth are you going to have that happening in this primordial soup where it's only selecting the left-handed amino acids? That's another problem that you have. The problem gets worse, all right? Let's assume by some miracle that there was a simple life form that somehow this primordial soup came into being. All right, it's there. In spite of all the probabilities I've just showed you, it just happened. Now let me ask you a question. If that thing can't reproduce itself, what's going to happen? It's going to die, and then you're going to what? Start over with those same probabilities, right? So here's the problem. You've got to have two simultaneous miracles in place at one and the same time. So here's the thing. The genetic code found in the DNA molecule, which is unbelievably complex. Right? DNA is built by protein machinery, but protein is coded for by DNA. In other words, you have to ask the question, which came first, the DNA or the protein? Both of them have to be there at one and the same time. So even if you have this life form in place, if the DNA is not already there to code for reproduction, that thing is never going to survive. And so which came first, the DNA or the protein? It's kind of like the old chicken and the egg paradox. Now we as Christians know which came first. The chicken came first because God created the chicken. But that's the question, which came first, the DNA or the proteins? So DNA could stand for definitely no accident. I think it is overwhelming proof that there is a designer. Matter of fact, let's talk for a minute about information and complexity. DNA, as Skip pointed out in his presentation yesterday, is the most efficient information storage system known in the universe. Let me highlight a book by a German creation scientist, Werner Gitt. It's called In the Beginning Was Information. In Gitt's book, he says this. Let me give you a quote from his book. He says, since the findings of James Watson and Francis Crick, it was increasingly realized by contemporary researchers that the information residing in the cells is of crucial importance for the existence of life. Anybody who wants to make meaningful statements about the origin of life would be forced to explain how the information originated. All evolutionary views are fundamentally unable to answer this crucial question. So Gitt is saying, if you want to explain the origin of life, you've got to explain where the information that is on the DNA came from. That is critical that you do that. Now, Gitt's a creationist. Let me show you basically the same idea by Paul Davies, a famous evolutionist, who puts it this way. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. There's no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Let me give you one more quote. And this one's from a fascinating book that I found a few years ago called There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. It's written by a man by the name of Antony Flew that unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. Antony Flew at one time was one of the world's most famous atheists. He was a philosopher, and he literally used to debate Christians on the existence of God. He would debate Christian apologists, and he was worldly renowned as that. But he actually, unfortunately, as far as I know, he never became a Bible-believing Christian, but he did become a theist before he died. And the reason he became a theist was the argument that I'm talking about right now, this argument about information. And here's what he says in his book. He said, the philosophical question that has not been answered in Origin of Life studies is this: how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? Here we're not dealing with biology, but an entirely different category of problem. Let me illustrate what he's saying. That is an excellent point. If I have a compact disc in my hand, let's say I have a CD in my hand up here, that CD is tangible, it's material. I can actually use it as a frisbee and throw it at you if I want to, but that's a material object. But the information that is stored on that CD is not material. So how can you even conceive of a material process that can create that information? Does that make sense? Information can't be created by a material process. And so that's what all these men have been quoting are saying. Information doesn't arise by chance because it's not material. Here's what Werner Gitt says. There is no known natural law through which matter can give rise to information. Neither is any physical process or material phenomenon known that can do this. Information can be as simple as the Morse code, which is nothing more than a series of dots and dashes. But if you have enough time and space, you can write a novel using the Morse code. As already mentioned, DNA, in contrast, is the most efficient information storage system we know. Another example of information is the English language. The letters in our alphabet convey information if they are placed in the words. Now, they only convey information, though, if you speak English. If you don't understand the code system, in this case the English language, that's still nonsense. But if you understand English, that BAT conveys information to you. And so those letters can be arranged in such a way it conveys information. Warner Gettigan says a code system is always the result of a mental process. It requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized that matter as such is unable to generate any code. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. Let me illustrate that. And I know you can't see this very well, so I'll try to help you maybe with what you can't read up there. I'm from the state of West Virginia. In eastern West Virginia, there's a little town called Green Bank, where they have a lot of these radio telescopes, all right, that are peering out into outer space. And one of the things, among other things they're doing, they're involved in the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And what they're doing is they're searching for the simplest of coded radio signals from space. If they got an SOS from outer space, it would be on the front page of every newspaper in the world the next day that there's intelligent life in space, because they all know that codes do not arise by chance. This guy on the left says, at any day now, we'll pick up a tiny coded signal, then we'll know for certain there's no intelligence out there, because coded information does not arise by chance. The scientist on the right, maybe he's a microbiologist, he says the precisely coded information in each cell would fill many books, but we know for certain that no intelligence created life. Do you see the hypocrisy there? Do you see that hypocrisy? I mean, again, a simple coded system would indicate life. Over here, all the information on DNA, well, that just happened by chance. Bottom line is this: information does not arise by chance. And information, I'm convinced, is just screaming for everyone to hear. There's intelligence. There's an intelligent designer. Of course, we believe that designer is God. But I think if we're open, it's very obvious. Let me give you one more quote from Anthony Flew, the atheist who changed his mind. He says, "This too is my conclusion. The only satisfactory explanation for the origin of such indirected, self-replicating life as we see on Earth is an infinitely intelligent mind." And I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. So here's my conclusion. I believe if we look at information and the DNA molecule, the information that's on it, and we look at that based on observational science, it is my conviction that that is much better explained by the Word of God and the creation model than it is by the model of evolution. And obviously people can disagree with me, but I think it's far better explained by a biblical model. Matter of fact, I would argue this, that what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word, and I think over and over and over again, if we let the evidence speak for itself in any field of science, that we over and over will determine that, again, what we see in the world agrees with what we see in His Word. Now, let me move on, and let's assume, could evolution have occurred assuming initial life? In other words, let's assume there is that initial life form. And I'm going to grant them this huge assumption, because I've already just said I don't think that's possible. It's blatantly impossible. Let's assume they do have this initial life form. Do the proposed mechanisms for biological evolution, and there are only two, natural selection and mutations, allow for biological evolution? Could that have happened? What would be the mechanisms for change? Because if evolution happened, you have a lot of change from single-celled invertebrates, invertebrates to fish, fish to amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, etc. What is the mechanism that's driving all this change? There's got to be something. Okay, what is it? Skip talked about this yesterday, so this is going to be somewhat review if you were here yesterday. But do animals change? Well, of course they change. We see that all the time. According to the book of Genesis, all creatures are reproducing after their kind. Kind is not equivalent to any man-made classification system, but God created certain kinds. Baramens created kinds from the words in Hebrew. That there's a lot of variety within the kinds, but you can't get from one kind to another. A lot of variety of dogs and cats, but no dads and no cogs. All right, if you get the idea. All right. Genesis 1:25 is an example. God created the beasts of the earth after its kind, so they're reproducing after their kind. So therefore, you're going to have a lot of variety. You have, for instance, the feline kind. All of these are probably the same created kind. You have, you want to call this the elephant kind, the pachyderm kind, whatever. These are probably all the same created kind. The same way with all this is the horse kind. Probably all the same created kind. You go to the Creation Museum outside of Cincinnati, you can see a zonkey, and they're trying to show you something. And again, those creatures can interbreed, so it's the same created kind, a cross between a donkey and a zebra. Now, let me give you a couple definitions, and I don't particularly like these terms, but to the terms that are typically used, so I think it's important that we understand these terms, and I want to define these terms. I want to make a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution would simply be change within a kind. And by the way, sometimes evolutionists will say we as creationists don't believe even in microevolution. That's a straw man. That's not true. That is scientifically verifiable. Everyone can see change within a kind. When Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands and all those finches on the different islands had different beak size and whatever, that is an example of microevolution. We see it all the time. Macroevolution, though, would be the molecules to man evolution, change from one kind to another. So it's two very different things, and we need to understand that. Let me give you a quote from a famous evolutionist, Marjorie Green, a philosopher of science, who said that the color of moths and snails or the bloom of the castor bean stem are explained by mutation and natural selection is very likely, but how from single cell, in that matter from inanimate ancestors, there came to be castor beans and moths and snails, and how from these there emerged llamas and hedgehogs and lions and apes and men, that is a question which the neo-Darwinian theory simply leaves unasked. Now, I've talked to some evolutionists before who will basically tell me, and this seems logical at first, they'll say if you have enough microevolution, in other words, if you have enough small changes added up over time, eventually that'll add up into large changes or macroevolution. That makes sense on the surface, doesn't it, when you first hear it? But the problem with that is every example we've ever observed in nature of microevolution is an example of a decrease in genetic information, whereas macroevolution requires a huge increase in genetic information. I'll show you more about that in a second. I've heard this illustration. People will say, if I'm in Chicago and I'm in a train station and I see a train leave the station and I don't see it go the whole distance, but I see it go the first mile, I can assume that it will eventually make its way to New York City because I saw it going there the first mile. And my response is, not if it's headed toward Los Angeles, you are. Not if it's going the other direction. You're not going to assume that at all, because that's the problem. All right? You need a huge increase in information, not a decrease. And again, every example of microevolution that I've ever heard of is a decrease of genetic information. Now let me illustrate this further. To go from, let's say, a molecule, let's say like an amoeba to a horse, you might think the biggest difference is the size, but that's not really the case at all. Because to go from a molecule to a horse, you've got to add a whole library of new genetic information. And so the question becomes, like, where does that information come from? It has to come from somewhere. You know, where is it? Does it just randomly appear out of nowhere? Where does that information come from? Again, it's got to be somewhere. And that is the key to increasing complexity. Another example, to go from a microbe to a man. It's estimated that a microbe has about 2 books of 500 pages worth of coded genetic information, where a human would have 1,000 books worth. So again, any theory attempting to explain molecules to man information evolution has to explain how that information got into the genome. Now, can natural selection be the answer? Can natural selection provide that new information? Well, what is natural selection? It's the ability to adapt to the environment. It's the survival of the fittest. Can natural selection cause one kind of species to become a new kind? And the answer is definitively no, because natural selection, by definition, only selects from information that's already there. Just like artificial selection, when breeders are breeding for a certain type of dog, they can't create new information. They take the information, the traits that they already see in dogs, and they select the traits they want, they breed for those traits. They're taking the information that's already there. That's the same way. Natural selection can't cause information. It can cause a loss of information, but not a gain of information. Skip illustrated this yesterday. We'll use his example again of dogs. There's a huge variety of wild dogs in this world, but they're all canines. That's an example of natural selection. And not only the wild dog varieties, but we know that all of our domestic dogs originally came from some sort of a wild dog, and all of our domestic dogs, same thing. They're still all canines. There's a lot of differences, but they're still all canines. And let's, again, using his example from yesterday, we have these two dogs that get off the ark at Mount Ararat, and they reproduce, they have puppies, and over time you're going to have lots and lots of dogs. As they go in different directions all over the face of the earth, the gene pool will be split as they go in different directions, and you probably remember genetics from middle school or high school or wherever it was. But even if you start out with dogs that can have puppies of long or short hair, eventually you may get a case where, like a collie, something like that. Can a collie, two collies get together and have puppies that have short hair? Is that possible? Why not? They've lost that information for short hair. That information is gone. So you can, even if you want to, define a collie as a new species, if you want to use that word, but it hasn't gained any information, it's actually lost information. And so, again, depending on which direction the dogs went, the dogs in the hotter climates would do better with short hair. Most of the long-haired variety would die out. The dogs in the colder climate would do better with long hair. Short-haired variety would probably die. That's natural selection in action. We can see that. That makes perfect sense. And then again, you start with something like a wolf and you work your way down to a chihuahua, which is nothing but a genetic mutant. All right? And let me illustrate it this way. Which is more healthy? A purebred dog or a dog-pound mutt? The mutt. These purebred dogs you have to buy life insurance for, or medical insurance. They have so many problems. But a dog-pound mutt, you can run over with a Mack truck and it gets up and keeps going. All right? And here's the thing. The purebreds have been so interbred that they have the same mistakes on their genes in the same places. And so that's the problem. So again, all this illustrates that microevolution is a loss of genetic information. You can even take human beings, and there's human beings that are 3'9", and human beings that are 7'1". Well, is that evolution? No, that's just genetic variation and natural selection. That's not evolution. You could call it microevolution if you want. Wherefore, it's misleading at best when the media or the scientific establishment attempt to prove molecules to man evolution by citing simple examples of natural selection or microevolution, and I see this happening all the time. They'll say, see, this moth has changed color, or see whatever the case, and therefore we see evolution there, so therefore that proves evolution, and they've changed their definition of evolution mid-sentence. They've moved from micro to macro, and they haven't told you about it. Philip Johnson, in his book, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds, says that one word evolution can mean something so tiny it hardly matters, or so big it explains the history of the universe. Keep your baloney detector trained on the word, and if it moves, zap it. And that's a very good quote. Now, do mutations supply the new information necessary for evolution? All right? Hypothetically, a beneficial mutation might occur. Let's assume natural selection selects that over the existing genes or any detrimental mutations that code for the same function. The mutation can be inherited by the offspring, and hypothetically, that could bring about new information. But everyone knows that the vast majority of mutations are not beneficial. Like this chicken with no feathers, or this two-snouted pig. Almost all mutations are harmful. There are some that are neutral, but we all know they're typically not good. There's all different types of mutations. I won't get into that right now. But sometime, evolutionists will give you examples of what they claim are beneficial mutations. Let me give you some examples. They talk about flightless birds on islands that can actually swim and dive better, which would be an advantage in that context. Talk about wingless beetles on windy islands that are not as easily blown out to sea. Talk about eyeless fish in caves deep under the water where you can't see anyway, and having an eye can just cause infection if you bump it on a rock. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. All three of those so far, are those examples of an increase in information or a decrease? Decrease. That's very obvious. But then we also have bacterial resistance to antibiotics and insect resistance to pesticides. But properly understood, all are losses, not increases in genetic information. Let's take this example of the bacteria, H. pylori here. And so there's an antibiotic that can be absorbed absorbed through the cell wall that then produces an enzyme that is converted into a poison, and the bacteria normally dies. However, there are some mutant strains where that doesn't happen and they continue to reproduce and that bacteria survive. What has happened is there's a mutation and that bacteria lacks the ability to produce the enzyme, and so it survives, but not because of more information, but because of less information. And Dr. J.C. Sanford says this about that: the resistant bacterium has not evolved. In fact, it has digressed genetically and is defective. Such a mutant strain is rapidly replaced by the superior natural bacteria as soon as the antibiotic is removed. And so there again, we have an example of a decrease in genetic information. I won't take the time to get into this much, but in pesticides, a lot of the resistance for these various pesticides that are finding were already in the population. So again, this is not an example of molecules to man evolution. For the sake of time, I'm going to move past this and go to here. Dr. Lee Spatner, his Jewish information scientist, taught at Johns Hopkins University's book, Not by Chance. He says, but in all the reading I've done in the life science literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. Basically what he's saying is, maybe there is a mutation that's added information, but he's never found it. And he's been studying and looking and trying to find it, but all the mutations he's ever studied actually reduce, not increase genetic information. And for evolution to be true, you've got to have thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these things added together that are increasing information. And you just don't find it. And that's what this quote is basically saying. You're going to need thousands of lucky appropriate events to form this single plant or animal. Thus miracles will become the rule. Events with an infinitesimal probability would not fail to occur. You know, if evolution were really true, we would expect that over time, natural selection would eliminate some of the genetic diseases and harmful disorders that we see in mankind. But it's not happening at all. It's just the opposite. We have over 6,000 Mendelian diseases today, such as cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia. The bottom line is the human genome is slowly degrading to random nonsense. It's not getting more information. What happens when you take, for instance, an audio tape and you copy it over and over and over and over again? Does it get more random, or does more information get added? It gets more random. And that's exactly what's happening to the human genome. One of the most amazing books, and I have loved this topic and have read for years, but this book here, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome by Dr. J.C. Sanford, and Skip mentioned this individual yesterday. I think he was a professor at Cornell. He was not even a believer. He discovered the gene gun process of genetically engineering plants. But in his book, the basic thesis of this book is this: not only can evolutionists not explain how the information got there, they can't explain how it's still there. And the reason for that is every generation of human beings, the most conservative of estimates is that every baby is born with 100 new mutations. And it's probably much more than that. 2 to 3% of all babies born today have visible birth defects. We have tens of thousands of mutations. And if the human race were really as old as evolutionists claim it is, it ought to be like any one of us that marry any other human being. It would be like marrying our brother or sister. And we would have the same sort of problems because there would be so many mistakes in the genome. And so that is, I can't see how anybody can read this book and still be an evolutionist, because he basically determined it's not, they can't even account for why the information is still there, much less how it got there. So there again, when you look at the created kinds, when you look at the possibility of evolution just from the basis of observational science, I would argue that the biblical model much better explains the others. Now we'll do one more thing, and it won't take long, but I want to ask one more question. Does the complexity of life allow for evolution? In Psalm 139:14, the psalmist says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And our bodies are indeed a marvel of complexity. Charles Darwin, in his book, admitted that it would be very difficult for his theory to explain a complex organ like the eye. The eye is incredibly complex. There's a diagram of the eye. But let me ask a question. Think about the step-by-step process formation, hypothetically, of the eye. Let's say you're 50% there. Let me ask a question. If you have 50% of an eye, what percentage of vision do you have?
0.
If you have 90% of an eye in place, what percentage of vision do you have? Zero, most likely zero. So it's impossible to even conceive of a step-by-step process. Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionist, has postulated that maybe the eye started as something like a light-sensitive spot. Maybe that's how it started. All right, now that's where he starts. Right? That's his beginning point in his argument. Michael Behe, in his book Darwin's Black Box, Behe is a part of the intelligent design movement, a teacher at Lehigh University, says not only is the eye exceedingly complex, but the light-sensitive spot with which Dawkins begins his case is itself a multicell organ, each of whose cells makes the complexity of a motorcycle or television set look paltry in comparison. And that's where Dawkins starts. 1949, in debate, the famous British evolutionist J.B.S. Haldane claimed that evolution can never produce various mechanisms such as the will and magnet, which would be useless till fairly perfect. Well, today we know that monarch butterflies and some bacteria use magnetic sensors for navigation. Not only do we have wheels in nature, this is a bacterial flagellum, a diagram of that. It can revolve about 100,000 revolutions per minute, stop practically on a dime, and turn the other direction. You can get 8 million of these in the cross-sectional area of a human hair. It's basically something that certain bacteria use to propel themselves in different directions. And look at that thing. That looks like a motor a human engineer has designed. It's got a rotor and a stator and a universal joint and all that. And we're to believe that that all happened by a step-by-step process. It's unbelievable. Michael Behe, in his book Darwin's Black Box, has coined a term called irreducible complexity. And he defines that term this way. He says a system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. He uses an illustration in his book of a simple mousetrap. And his question is, conceive of a step-by-step process to get to those 5 parts all in one, at one time and place. What part can you do without and still catch a mouse? And if you think about it, you have to have a hammer, that's what kills the mouse. You have to have the platform, that's what holds it all together. You have to have the spring, that's what applies the pressure. I guess you could chase the mouse around doing that if you wanted to. But then you have to have the catch and the holding bar to activate it. Bottom line is that is irreducibly complex because you cannot do without any one of the parts and it'll still be effective. It has to all be there at one time in one place. Nature's the same way. You take something like a giraffe, it's irreducibly complex. Because of its long neck, the blood pressure in the neck has to be extremely high to get that blood all the way to the brain. However, when it bends down to get a drink of water, thus increasing the pressure, there's a real problem there. Because potentially, this could be enough pressure to burst the blood vessels in the neck, and you've got an issue there when that happens. But the giraffe just so happens to have pressure sensors along arteries that can detect a rise in pressure. This causes the contraction of artery walls, allowing arteries to constrict, controlling blood flow. Some arteries approaching the head then bypass the brain. Also, heavily valved veins control the return of the blood to the heart. Bottom line is, which came first, the long neck or the rest of the package? They had to be there together or it never would have survived. There is not a conceivable step-by-step process that you can think of that can lead to the formation of a giraffe, so therefore it's irreducibly complex. So therefore, my conclusion again is what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. Origin of life by natural processes is not possible. Even if you had eternity at your disposal, there's not enough time and it's too complex. We're all looking at the same evidence. Many scientists do believe in creation. Either evolution or creation can be proved scientifically. Both involve faith. So it's your choice.